Imagine being stranded on a tiny island with almost no fresh water, almost no food, and no way to know when help will come. At first, everyone is simply trying to survive. People search the rocks for water. Families stay close together. Men look toward the horizon, hoping to see a ship. Then something changes. The wreck has already taken their home, their supplies, and their sense of safety. But the real danger is no longer the ocean. It is the people standing beside them. One man, Jeronimus Cornelisz, begins gaining influence over the survivors. Another, Wiebbe Hayes, starts organizing people around something very different: protection, order, and survival. And slowly, the island becomes divided. Because when people believe rescue may never come, fear doesn't always make them stronger. Sometimes, it changes what they are willing to do to one another. The Batavia was wrecked in 1629, but the shipwreck was only the beginning. On October 29, 1628, the Batavia left the Netherlands. It was a large Dutch East India Company ship, heading toward the Dutch-controlled trading world of Asia. On board were sailors, soldiers, merchants, passengers, and families. The ship was carrying valuable cargo, including silver. For the people aboard, this was not supposed to be a story about survival. It was supposed to be a journey. A dangerous one, certainly, but a journey with a destination. The Batavia crossed thousands of miles of ocean. And somewhere along the way, something inside the expedition began to go wrong. The ship's commander was Francisco Pelsaert, but the man who would later become central to the tragedy was Jeronimus Cornelisz. Cornelisz was the senior merchant aboard the Batavia. He was educated. He could communicate confidently. And he had a position that gave him influence among the people around him. At this point, however, there was no reason for the passengers to think of him as the center of a future disaster. He was simply another man aboard a ship. Then came June 4, 1629. The Batavia was sailing near the Abrolhos Islands, off the western coast of Australia. The waters were dangerous, and during the night, the ship struck a reef. The impact was catastrophic. Wood splintered. Water entered the vessel. People were thrown into confusion. The ship that had carried them halfway across the world was suddenly breaking apart beneath them. Some people reached the islands. Others were rescued from the wreck. But escaping the ship did not mean they were safe. The survivors were now scattered across a group of small, rocky islands. And the islands offered very little. There was almost no fresh water. There was limited food. There was no comfortable shelter. And the ocean surrounded them in every direction. Imagine what that would feel like. You have survived a shipwreck. You are alive. You can breathe. Your feet are on solid ground. But then you look around. There is nowhere to go. The horizon is empty. And you don't know when another ship will appear. The wrecked Batavia was still nearby. That meant some supplies could be recovered. But there was another problem. The survivors needed help from somewhere, far beyond the horizon. Francisco Pelsaert knew this, so he made a difficult decision. He would leave the islands with a small group and attempt to reach Batavia, in present-day Indonesia. The journey was incredibly dangerous, but if he succeeded, he could return with a rescue ship. For the people left behind, however, this created a terrible uncertainty. They had no way of knowing when Pelsaert would return, or whether he would return at all. And Cornelisz was left with authority among the survivors. This is where the psychological side of the story becomes important. Because the conditions were changing. At first, people were united by the same problem. Everyone needed water. Everyone needed food. Everyone wanted rescue. But when resources become scarce, people don't always remain united. They begin making choices. Who gets water first? Who controls the supplies? Who can be trusted? Who is dangerous? And who might become dangerous if pushed too far? Cornelisz began building influence. He gathered men around him. The evidence from the survivors' accounts tells us that killings began. And they did not happen because the island suddenly became chaotic in one moment. The violence developed. One decision led to another. People were threatened. People disappeared. Some were murdered. And the more control Cornelisz and his followers gained, the harder it became for others to resist them. This is one of the most disturbing parts of the Batavia story. There was no great army on the island. There were no walls around a city. There was just a small group of survivors. And yet fear could become its own form of control. If people believed that refusing an order might put their family in danger, obedience became easier. If someone disappeared, others learned to remain silent. And if everyone believed that rescue might never come, the future itself became frightening. But not everyone accepted what was happening. Among the survivors was Wiebbe Hayes. Hayes was a soldier. He did not have Cornelisz's influence, but he had something else. He could organize people. Hayes gathered survivors around him and moved toward another island. There, they began building a defensive position. They searched for water. They collected food. They used the island itself for protection. And slowly, another community began to form. This was more than a physical separation. It was a psychological one. Cornelisz's group represented control through fear. Hayes's group was trying to create safety through cooperation and defense. Both groups were trapped. Both were running out of time. And neither knew when rescue would come. From the outside, the islands might have looked almost peaceful. Blue water, rocky shores, open sky. But inside that small community, trust had almost disappeared. People watched one another. A person approaching from the wrong direction could be a threat. A movement at night could mean something had gone wrong. And every day without a rescue ship made the situation worse. Hayes and his followers knew they could not simply wait. They had to protect themselves. Cornelisz and his followers also understood that Hayes's group was becoming a problem. If Hayes could hold his position, Cornelisz could not control everyone. So the two sides moved toward confrontation. The weapons of the period were crude compared with modern standards. But on a small island, even simple weapons could change the balance. Hayes's defensive position gave his group an advantage. And that advantage mattered. Attempts to overcome the group failed. Hayes's men resisted. They knew they were fighting for more than territory. They were fighting for the right to remain alive. And while this was happening, Pelsaert was still trying to return. Back in the Dutch East Indies, he managed to obtain another ship. The rescue vessel was the Sardam. Then he sailed back toward the Abrolhos Islands. But the people on the islands didn't know this. They couldn't see the Sardam. They couldn't hear its crew. They couldn't know whether Pelsaert had survived his own journey. All they could do was wait. And then one day, something appeared on the horizon. A ship. For the survivors, that sight must have been almost impossible to process. After weeks of uncertainty, there was finally proof that the outside world still existed. The Sardam had arrived. And the balance of power changed almost immediately. Cornelisz could no longer control the situation. He was taken into custody. The survivors were finally able to speak. And what the rescuers heard was devastating. The shipwreck had killed people, but many others had died after surviving the wreck. They had been killed by other survivors. The rescue, therefore, became an investigation. Pelsaert and his men had to understand what had happened on those islands. They listened to testimony. They examined evidence. They identified those responsible. And the punishment was severe. This was the 17th century. Dutch authorities did not approach justice as modern courts would. The punishments reflected the brutal legal standards of that time. Cornelisz was executed. Others who participated in the violence were also punished. But one name stood apart from the story of Cornelisz: Wiebbe Hayes. Hayes had helped organize resistance. He had protected survivors. And his actions had helped prevent Cornelisz's control from becoming even more destructive. The contrast between the two men is what makes the story so psychologically interesting. They were trapped in the same disaster. They faced the same shortage of water. They saw the same empty horizon. They both knew that rescue might not come, but their responses were very different. Cornelisz moved toward control. Hayes moved toward protection. And that difference raises a difficult question. What exactly changes when people believe normal rules no longer apply? We often imagine survival situations as simple. You are hungry. You find food. You are thirsty. You find water. You are threatened. You fight. But real survival is rarely that simple. People still have relationships. They still have fear. They still remember what happened yesterday. They still worry about what will happen tomorrow. And when resources disappear, trust becomes a resource too. The Batavia shows what can happen when that trust begins to collapse. But it also shows that collapse is not inevitable. Hayes and the people around him had almost nothing. Yet they organized. They defended one another. They shared limited resources. They held their position. And eventually, they survived long enough to see a rescue ship. Centuries later, the Batavia itself would become an archaeological site. Its remains were discovered beneath the waters of Western Australia. Objects from the wreck were recovered. Cannons, ship fragments, artifacts from the voyage. The wreck became physical evidence of the journey. But the islands tell another part of the story. A shipwreck is normally remembered as the moment a ship sinks. For the Batavia, that isn't where the story ends. In some ways, that's where the most difficult part begins. The ocean destroyed the ship. The island removed the normal structures of society. Scarcity created fear. Fear created suspicion. And suspicion helped create violence. But the same conditions also produced resistance. That is why this story is more complicated than simply calling Cornelisz a monster and Hayes a hero. Those labels tell us something, but they don't explain the human behavior. The real question is what happens inside a group when certainty disappears. When there is no police force, no government, no nearby town, no supermarket, no hospital, no telephone, just a small island, a limited amount of water, and the knowledge that nobody may come. The Batavia survivors were not living in a story. They didn't know how the story would end. They didn't know that historians would study their choices nearly 400 years later. For them, each decision was immediate. A cup of water, a person approaching the camp, a weapon being carried across the rocks, a distant shape on the horizon, and eventually a rescue ship. That is what makes the Batavia so difficult to forget. The shipwreck was a disaster, but the real mystery is what happened afterward. Why did some people use fear to gain power? Why did others risk their lives to protect strangers? And how much of human behavior is shaped by the situation around us? We may never completely answer those questions, but the evidence left behind gives us enough to know one thing. The Batavia did not simply sink in 1629. It left behind a story about survival, power, fear, and the choices people make when they believe nobody is coming. And perhaps the most unsettling part is this: the people on those islands did not know they were living through history. They were simply trying to survive another day.